contradictions in the opposition of an abstract society, tugging and pulling with a likewise abstract nature, cannot grasp the deep logic of this epoch-making transformation as expressed in land cover change and the continuities that these apparently opposing processes of deforestation and reforestation actually express. Now, there has been recently important contributions to this kind of interpretation of the history of this region, most notably Thomas Kluok's recent book on forest in this region as well. In this paper, however, I would like to criticize some of the conclusions that Kluok draws from it. So I'll try to go through an overview relatively quickly. So this region has some crucial particularities, which makes it, makes it a kind of not only an arbitrary kind of selection of geographic selection in Chile, but it has actually an historical reality, because this was one of the few regions in Latin America where the indigenous population could actually pose an effective military resistance to the Spanish conquest. So it remained on the margins of the colonial regime up until way into the independent history of Chile and Argentina, up until the last decades of the 19th century. Now, from in that moment, the last decades and the 19th century, and roughly in the last 40 years, there have been a kind of huge transformations in both moments, like I mentioned before. Huge, millions of hectares in in few decades of deforestation in the last part of the 19th century, and of reforestation in the last 4 decades. So in the occupation and what I call a first wave of primitive accumulation, in 1861, the Chilean state undertakes a series of military campaigns after consolidating the occupation of the northern parts of what now is Chile, with the invasion of Bolivia and the war against Bolivia and Peru. They begin to expand southwards, and the Mapuche were the Mapuche people, which are the indigenous population here, were reduced to 5% of the previous extension of their lands, and they effectively became transformed from increasingly wealthy and highly mobile agropastoralists to impoverished peasants living in marginal lands and reliant on subsistence agriculture, many of them. This is what it's called normally a forced peasantization or campesinization forzada of the Mapuche population. All the newly occupied lands were declared public property, and a really radical process of a chaotic process of settlement quickly followed. In this way, deforestation was quickly implicated in a twofold process of military control and expansion of markets. After the violent elimination of Mapuche territorial control, forests were massively burned to establish land claims, impose a commodity form upon land, and submitted to the vertiginous dynamics of speculation. The increased fertility produced by the burning of huge amounts of biomass gave way to a transient boom in the region's agricultural production. For several decades, the region became redefined as Chile's granary. So, emerging from this whole process, there was a very particular agrarian structure, very concentrated, very typical of the Latin American countryside, which is the latifundio, the very large state, the hacienda as well. The organization of land and labor, this is the way in which the region landscape was produced, came to be structured around the hacienda, as I was saying, as a dominant socio-natural form. It was characterized by many things. One highly concentrated agrarian structure, the voracious commercial extraction of frontier forests, and high by rapidly declining yields in wheat production on cleared lands which were quickly eroding. An ample and impoverished rural proletariat, which created a sort of centrifugal dynamic of settlements to the frontier forest and established kind of pockets of small holding in mountain valleys. And the confinement of the Mapuche population to a form of racially segregated communal smallholding, the reducciones, and seasonal wage labor in large states. So this socio-natural form implied its own contradictions and crises. These conditions, as recently argued by Klubok, created a self-reinforcing dynamic of ecological degradation and land concentration that by the mid-20th century led to the landless peasantry accounting for around half of the rural population. This created conditions of social unrest that in extreme cases took on insurrectionary proportions like for instance the events that led to the Ranquil peasant massacre in 1974. Indeed, Klubok makes a point of how the origins of the Chilean forestry industry are to be located in this period rather than in the neoliberal one, as a very important kind of ecological fix that the state was trying to introduce here, of an attempt to govern these contradictions by regulating the irrational exploitation of forests and enrolling this landless peasantry into modern labor arrangements. Yeah, basically this is that. Well, all of this led by the late 60s, the balance of power had completely shifted. With the backdrop of the Cuban Revolution, political elites began realizing that the agrarian structure was a real political hazard, you know, and it was a quite volatile situation. So from both left and right, people began being conscious that land reform was actually needed. And this process would reach its radical momentum with the Unidad Popular government held by Salvador Allende. The really important part here is the rising organization of the peasantry. In 1964, in this process, in 1964, 18 legal peasant unions had only 1,800 members in the whole country, and by 1972, unionized peasant numbered around over 282,000 members. And in 1967, during the first years of the reform process, there were only 9 illegal land occupations, and by the 71, over 1,000. So it was a very effervescent moment in which all these contradictions that had been instituted in the late 19th century, environmental and social, began doing a really important crisis. So. Well, the Mapuche population in particular seized this opportunity, even though the land reform was mainly structured in the terms and language of the peasantry as a class reivindication of the land to the tiller kind of demand. So in that sense, it didn't acknowledge the specific situation of the Mapuche, which were actually trying to reclaim land that they had been dispossessed of. However, despite this, the Mapuche saw the opportunity and were engaged in this process of land occupation. There were cooperatives being set in reclaimed land, and there were all sorts of experiments here, with a lot of tensions between the state kind of collectivization objectives of trying to establish a socialist kind of agrarian sector versus the kind of subsistence logic of the peasant agriculture. However, all this process would be would be thwarted, and finally, as you may know, this whole crisis was to be violently resolved in favor of capital with the military coup that overthrew Salvador Allende's government in 1973. This unleashed a new movement, or a new wave of primitive accumulation that would bring about a transformation in the region's socio-natural forms only comparable to that nearly a century before. In the first moment, agrarian policy was completely overhauled. Enforced disappearances, extrajudicial executions, imprisonment and torture were among the measures used to finish off the peasant organizations that had spearheaded the land reform process. This was the necessarily political counterpoint to the new and experimental economic agenda that was to be implemented. Drastic reduction or outright eliminations of tariffs and protectionist policies, land counter-reform, privatization of state agro-industrial enterprises, including forestry. The agrarian structure that will emerge from the counter-reform have very little to do with the traditional pre-reform hacienda. Traditional production geared towards the domestic market rapidly deteriorated as internal demand fell due to sharp decreases in wages and increased unemployment owing to rapid deindustrialization. Coupled with the competitive pressure from foreign subsidized production, the new conditions forced all landlords and smallholders alike to sell land to more competitive export-oriented producers. All these conditions thoroughly transformed the social relations of production in the countryside. It's important to understand that here the old landowning aristocracy wasn't just reconstituted as such. It was a complete transformation of the ruling classes as well, because many of these lands ended up on hands of big financial conglomerates that were more attuned to this kind of export-oriented industrial kind of modern form of agriculture. So it shifted the whole terms of or the whole socio-ecological articulation of accumulation, one could say. So labor was, on the one hand, violently disciplined through military means, while capital was submitted to the rigors of an unbridled and rescaled market forces. All of this unleashed a new socio-ecological articulation of capital accumulation, like I said, one at which inception the invisible hand and the iron fist could not maintain their apparent political distinctiveness, which I think is one of the hallmarks of waves of primitive accumulation. This movement not only re-established but unprecedentedly expanded value relations to previously uncommodified domains, notably water, for example. The government relative neglect of agricultural production contrasted with its policies on forestry, which combined the radical liberalization of markets with privatization and very intensive subsidies.
5 minutes.
Okay. 75% of subsidy to the cost of reforestation and special credits for companies. Many of the forest-based industries, plantations and nurseries established through public investments were sold at below the market prices to pro-regime financial groups. From 1974 to 1990, an annual average of 80,000 hectares of new plantations were established. So that by 1986, over 1 million hectares had been forested with pine and eucalyptus. Now, it's important to notice that the combination of all these conditions spelled disaster for the peasant economy. The military repression disarticulated any possibility of effective resistance to shock policies, where the combination of rescale market with selective subsidies quickly forced many smallholders and resident workers of agricultural estates to abandon lands. Subsidized plantations sprawled over old agricultural lands, and native forests were replaced in several regions. The transformed ecology and the loss of access to forest resources further marginalized peasant communities, which became increasingly encircled by deserted pine monocultures. On the other hand, landless the expanding forestry capital was further stimulated by the consequent availability of very cheap and very docile labor. Temporary workers were banned from unionizing, and they accounted for the majority of the labor force. And all these conditions contributed to the profitability of the industry, which then fed back into the changing landscape and further eroded the ecological viability of the peasant economy. So, okay, so I'm going to conclude now. It's important just to mention that all of this socio-natural form has its own contradictions and its own crises that are very apparent now in Chile, and it's one of the most volatile social conflicts right now in Chile. But just to conclude, several things come out of this overview of the history latent within the contemporary landscape that I described at the beginning. Once the main ecological transformations in the region are set within social coordinates, they reveal crucial continuities and in fact can be seen as the ecological instantiations of a common logic. The particular accumulation patterns implied in the socio-natural form, the hacienda and the corporate forestry, imply their own crisis tendencies and cycles of class decomposition and recomposition. We can see, for instance, how the process of colonization created the socio-ecological contradictions, which drove the whole region to a crisis spearheaded by the organized peasantry, but ultimately resolved in favor of a reconstituted ruling class. This process in turn installed contradictions of its own. Now, Kluber's account provides a much-needed corrective to the simplistic identification of forestry with neoliberalism in Chile. And as he correctly shows, exotic plantations played a crucial role in the state's effort to establish legibility and control over the chaotic socio-natural contradictions emerging from the occupation. His argument, however, misses a crucial point. While exotic plantations preceded the neoliberal regime, their unprecedented expansion can only be understood in the context of their enrollment as the ecological base of the counter-revolutionary reconstitution of class power through the neoliberal project. This is the expansion of pine and eucalyptus over south-central Chile's landscape, is the ecological expression of perhaps the most brutal process of class decomposition in Chilean history. This was not only this articulation of alternative political projects, but of their alternative ecological forms as well. Indeed, the Marxian notion of primitive accumulation signals a pivotal logic behind the process expressed by land cover change. And I think here the narratives around the forest transition kind of fall into this consequentialist bias of just by thinking that there's reforestation and deforestation. Here they conceptualize those as opposite pulling or different kind of logics, you know, but they share a common thing. So it's worth just, and with this I will close, that it's worth remembering that Marx's category was developed against classical political economist's notion of primitive accumulation as that of the accumulation of stock. For Marx, so-called primitive accumulation was above all the production of a novel relation premised on the separation of people from the condition of their own existence. Now, the case presented here shows that this process is an irreducibly socio-ecological one, in the sense that this separation is produced through concomitant socio-natural forms. Alienation, insofar as it is always alienated praxis, is an ecological phenomenon indeed, and a particularly cataclysmic one. The political ecology of Chile's neoliberal experiment can be seen here, but also in the mining, in the water-intensive mining projects in the north of the country, or the salmon farms in the Patagonian fjords. It is, however, crucial to remember that capitalist ecologists are not only enrolled in the production of particular commodities, but perhaps more fundamentally, that they produce a particular form of labor as much as they are produced by it. Forms of labor which are expressed, among other things, in the internally related patterns of urban and rural change. One should recall here Marx's comments about unhappy Mr. Peel, who, upon bringing workers and means of production, found out, after being besieged by desertion, that the only thing Western Australia's social ecology did not provide for were the conditions of for proletarian labor. So this is the basic ecological logic at play in Chile's so-called forest transition, be it expressed through chaotic deforestation or the proliferation of the contemporary neoliberal green deserts. Thank you.